One of the biggest myths that I would love to dispel for everybody is this perception that everybody is anti-GMO. It's just not true. And we have a lot of data to show that's the case. And obviously, there's a lot of brands and media out there that would like it. The story is more interesting if everybody is anti-GMO, but that's just not what the reality of it is.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
Good. How about you, Erum?
I'm doing well.
So I noticed this trend, and I'm curious if you've noticed the same thing. I've seen a number of people wearing these clunky black sneakers. I know black sneakers are always in, but I've noticed that there's these ones that have a very clunky heel to them. Am I seeing something that's new, or am I behind the trend?
Oh, I don't know. Actually, I saw those foam shoes that Kanye made, the Yeezys.
Yeah.
I've seen something like that, the same material, but it's boxy. They look almost like Kleenex boxes or like shoes from the future. It's kind of weird. And so I've seen that, but I don't know. So like a heel on a sneaker?
No, I would say it's much more like a very thick sole, maybe like an inch thick. The trend in running shoes right now is Hoka's. Hoka kind of set the trend, which you're shaking your head no.
No, I'm saying Hoka. My friend did a lot of research on feet and shoes and what's good. And you shouldn't wear shoes that are very cushiony because that messes up your feet. So like our feet are designed to walk on the earth and the ground, not on like foam. And that really Fs up your feet. So you need shoes that actually support, that almost give the ground grass effect, not too much cushion. And I think Hoka's have a lot of cushion in them.
I think Hoka kicked off the trend of these really thick, foamy soles. But what I've noticed is, and actually they kicked off the trend and then people followed them. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if these black sneakers that I've been seeing with these thick soles are the continuation of that trend. We went to the movies yesterday in Manhattan. We saw this Japanese movie called Evil Does Not Exist. It was a little bit of a tragic movie. I was not expecting that, but it was really beautiful. And it takes place in rural Japan. You'd appreciate this because it's a community that is about to have a glamping site built there. And it's about the community coming together and actually being against the way that the glampers are planning to develop this site. But I was looking at what people are wearing shoes-wise on the subway, and I kept noticing these black sneakers, and I was like, is that a trend?
Yeah. We're recording this, and next week we're going to have, I'll say a bye week, but we're going to have a replay because it's going to be 4th of July week. So we have off here at Messaging Lab the whole week. It means 4th of July, it's smack in the middle. It's always good to take some time to reflect on all the work we do because we're working nonstop, just moving. But we need the time to reflect and reset. I appreciate that you encourage that, Karl, for us and our team. But what are you going to get up to?
I'm going to go upstate. I haven't really been able to spend that much time there. And this is one of those unusual years where I won't be up in the Adirondacks as much as I'd like. But my goal is we'll be up there for a week. Then I'll come back down here, meaning coming back down to Brooklyn. And then I'll just be going back and forth. One of my goals for being up in the Adirondacks this year is to hike a mountain called Gothics. It's one of the top 10 high peaks. I've already hiked Mount Marcy and probably have done most of the top 10. But Gothics is one that I have not yet done. And it's loomed large for a really long time. How about you? What are you going to do, Erum?
Wow, that's going to be great. I am going to head to Montreal for the week. There is the Jazz Fest happening. So I'm excited for that. We were going to fly, and when we were planning on going to Montreal, we were looking for airplane tickets, and the tickets were fairly affordable a month and a half ago. I'm like, let's get it. My husband's like, no. It'll get cheaper. And I'm like, are you sure it'll get cheaper? Because it's a holiday week. I don't know. It's like, no, it'll get cheaper. Then the week goes by and gets more expensive, $200 adding every week. And now it's the week before. And I'm like, it's definitely not dropping because now it's $1,000 more.
Wow.
And I was just like, I told you. And I'm like, do we just bite it and just pay for it to take the flights? Because we already booked, like we do half Airbnb and half hotel for the week. And then I was like, you know what? I was watching the show Hacks. And I know that's one of your favorite shows.
I binge watched all episodes and I'm done with it now.
we're up to the point where they're on a road trip. So like, why don't we just make it into a road trip? Because it's not that far. I think it's 6 hours. And then we can drive to the Adirondacks and make it more of an adventure. But we were like, okay, wait, we have a 3-year-old. Is it going to drive us crazy? But I'm like, no, if we go in to this as a journey, it's not the destination. The destination is going to be great. We can make pit stops, go to falls, go here, go there. We might just go a day early and stay overnight at Lake George.
Yeah.
And just check out that scene. But yeah, summer's here and road trips and everything. So I'm so excited about next week. And I will miss our friends next week, but we will be sharing an exciting episode that we think everyone needs to listen to.
Absolutely. So the other big news that we've been tracking is that Ginkgo Bioworks has been restructuring. Ginkgo stock had been very much underwater compared to where they first started out. There's the challenge that they might be delisted from the stock exchange. It's tough to watch because we know a lot of people that are there, they're friends of ours, and we love Ginkgo and want them to succeed. What's your take on the Ginkgo restructuring, Erum?
Yeah, restructuring is always hard, but it is the nature of companies, depending on many different factors, just what's going on in the market, what decisions were made at the company in terms of what to focus on, what their strategy is. When new technologies come online, sometimes there's whole departments that might not need as many people. And we've seen this in the digital tech industry. Often it's not necessarily a big surprise. We've seen Ginkgo shifting their strategy, focusing more on pharma. But yeah, I think for us, we want to wish everyone the best. We've heard from former employees that are now moving on to different careers. We know people that remain at Ginkgo and who continue to hold down the fort. But those former employees of Ginkgo, they will seed the economy with the culture and knowledge that they gain from Ginkgo. So all the best to them. And we'll keep everyone posted. We love the company. It's great. We just love the culture and the people, and we're excited to see what's next for both the company and the former employees.
Let's just put it into perspective. In a way, it's still early days. The company was started in 2008 or so. It's a young company. They went public at the end of the pandemic. So we could say that going public was the beginning of the second act. And that means we haven't even reached the midpoint. There's challenges that they have to overcome, but we're excited to continue to watch what happens at Ginkgo and how they progress.
Yeah. And the big thing is oftentimes companies get vilified for layoffs. It's something that we hear in the media. It's like, oh, Facebook did layoffs, Amazon did layoffs. But again, it is the nature of organizations. So it's just a consequence of what's happening in the market. So good luck to them. But speaking of vilifying, a few episodes ago, I vilified synthetic vitamins. I might have made some statements saying that they don't work. I didn't mean to be very inclusive, saying all synthetic vitamins don't work. Of course, many of them do. It's just one of the things, some of them are just not as effective as getting natural vitamins. And oftentimes, if it's a synthetic vitamin, it's just one vitamin. And a few times we've spoken about the concept of entourage effects, where getting vitamins from fruits and vegetables, those fruits and vegetables have multiple molecules in them and they all play a role. So they might have more bioavailability, or they might be more effective, or some synthetic vitamins are just as effective. Not all vitamins are created equal. Everyone should do their own research depending on what vitamins they take. I know you take vitamins. How do you feel about this?
So just to be clear, when you say synthetic vitamins, what you're basically saying is the chemical that is the vitamin on its own, taking just that chemical as a nutritional supplement. That's what you mean, right?
When I say synthetic vitamins, I'm meaning vitamins that are made in the laboratory versus vitamins that are naturally occurring in fruits and vegetables and meats and food that we eat.
Got it. Okay, well, I try to eat nutritiously. It's not always possible. I also think, and I want someone to correct me if I'm wrong, but I also don't think food is as nutritious as we think it is. Probably the nutritional value of food has gone down over time.
Why do you think that?
Well, I think the soil, we add a lot of fertilizer to the soil. Probably that has been one of the reasons why vitamin concentrations have gone down. Again, I want someone to confirm this for me, but personally, I do take a number of vitamins. I take a multivitamin plus a bunch of other ones, but the big one for me is really vitamin D. I also take different kinds of magnesium because that helps me with sleeping, which I have terrible insomnia. But I think that you have to do your own research. I think it's a good point that you made. And I do know that you can learn about yourself and what vitamins you're supposed to take. I had a blood test 3 years or so ago, and I was low on B12. So I was taking B12 for a while. And then when my doctor did my blood panel again, she was like, oh, now your B12 is too high. Stop taking it. So I did. But these things fluctuate because it depends on what we eat, what we exercise, where we live. I think it's something that if you want to stay healthy, you should stay on top of it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of factors. I mean, age is a factor. Of course, we'll be talking more in this episode about our microbiomes and how they maybe affect the uptake. Again, we're just speculating here on what the possible influences are of vitamin absorption, whether they're synthetic or naturally occurring. But I think it's a good thought, Karl, in terms of getting a blood panel. I know when we had a conversation previously, I was mentioning, oh, wouldn't it be great if you took a blood panel from your doctor and it tells you where you're deficient and it tells you exactly what to take, whether you should take a vitamin that's a pill form, a synthetic, or do something. So if D3, it's like, okay, if you can go outside for this many minutes a day, you'll get your vitamin D, or no, that's not the type of vitamin D you need. You actually need this type of vitamin D because there's multiple vitamins. Obviously, there's like multiple B, D, E. They're all different. They all have very specific chemical structures. But it'd be good if they just gave you a recommendation of what to eat or what to do in order to increase or decrease or modulate the vitamins and molecules in your body. But you mentioned that there's a fancy blood panel. I don't know what else to call it.
So when you get your blood work done with your doctor, you have to request, or your doctor will request the extra blood work to get done to tell you whether you are deficient or have enough vitamins. But I know that you can self-do this, meaning you can order that kind of blood panel. There are fancy blood panels that will give you this kind of information. I think that they are probably $300 to $600 to $900. I don't know the brands. I know that if we were to follow someone like Brian Johnson, who's been hacking his age, he probably has some very specific recommendations on who to get these blood panels from. But I think it's something that maybe we explore it a little bit in the future, and we should try to get Brian on this podcast to talk about what he's doing to increase his longevity and decrease his aging.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Yeah. And one of the things to do to decrease your aging and stay healthy is reduce your sugar intake. A company that we love and adore that is rethinking sweetness rather than from sugars to get it from a sweet protein that they discovered in a berry found in very tropic regions. And this company is called Oobly. So Oobly, we're big fans of, and they're fans of our podcast, and they're fans of you, our listener. And they are giving away some chocolates to our listeners. So if you would like to try some Oobly chocolate, please fill in the form that's attached in the show notes. Just a link. Just go to the link, click it, just enter your information, and we'll send you some chocolate. So please try it. I tried it, Karl. You tried it. How'd you like it?
I love Oobly chocolates. I love the way it tastes. I think it's got a very interesting sweetness to it. It's not overly sweet the way some chocolates are. It tastes just like regular chocolate. The sweetness is a little bit different than normal sugar sweetened chocolate. But I think it's great. Fill out the form. Oobly's happy to send some samples out to our listeners.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let's get into our episode this week. This week, we're talking to Zack Abbott of Z Biotics. Z Biotics is a probiotic pre-alcohol, something that you would take before you go out on the town and drink to prevent the effects of post-drinking. And I remember I had seen Zack 6 or so years ago at a Symbio Beta. We didn't really get to know each other until last year, but he was serving samples of the prebiotic up on the roof of a building in San Francisco that had been a Honda dealership one year, and people were just crowded around Zack's table. And Zack has been someone who's been around Symbio Beta for many years. Like I said, I didn't really get to know him until last year, but I've always thought he would be a great guest for our podcast.
Yeah, I saw Zack for the first time last year at Symbio Beta on a panel where he was talking about Zbiotics and the pre-alcohol and also the labeling of GMOs. And he'll talk about this more in the episode. But funny story is after we recorded this episode, like 2 days later, a friend of mine showed me their phone and they were like, oh, have you seen this ad. Do you know anything about this product? And it was a Zbiotic ad on their Instagram feed. And I was like, hey, oh my gosh, I just interviewed the founder.
That's really funny.
And they're like, does it work? And I was like, you're going to have to tune in to the episode and find out. But I did also give them a little bit of brief cliff notes just so they can make a decision. But we do know many people tried it. Our friend Shelby, she tried it when it first came out and gave her synopsis, and it was a very good review. We'll let Zack take it away and share more about the origin story of Z Biotics and what it does and how it works and how it can work for you. Zack Abbott, thank you so much for coming on the Grow Everything podcast. I'm so excited to speak with you.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about what we're working on and deliver what we got to say.
Awesome. Yeah. So we just want to kick it off by learning what inspired you to co-found Z Biotics. We gave a little bit of information in our intro about it, but we want to hear from you. And what is your product and what inspired you to create it?
Yeah. So what inspired me here was really that this seemed like a very simple and obvious idea from a microbiology standpoint. Just getting bacteria perform thousands of functions already. And the probiotics industry to date is like, here, eat them. And maybe one of these functions tangentially might help you in some way. But we don't really know what that'll be. And the idea that we could just use modern biotechnology to give it a very one additional specific function that we know would be beneficial seemed really obvious. And then as I looked around, I didn't really see a lot of people working on this. And that was surprising to me. It felt like low-hanging fruit. So that was like the scientific inspiration. But at that point, it was really as a scientist, I was just thinking about this not as a company or a business or anything. I just was like, oh, this is something people should do. But then as I sort of layer on the context that the world at the time that I started Zbiotics, I walk through the grocery store and I see the non-GMO butterfly on all of these different products. And that had nothing to do with the GMO conversation. Non-GMO wheat flour, even though there is no genetically engineered wheat, and non-GMO water and salt and like all these things that like don't have genetic information. So those things really, as a scientist, I was frustrated that while there was a reasonable conversation to be had around some of the applications of genetic engineering, that unfortunately the technology that was used to make the products that I think we could have a debate around, that technology was being thrown under the bus. And a lot of people who had nothing to do with that conversation were throwing it under the bus to make themselves a quick buck. And so that to me was really risky and scary and dangerous. And so I could go on Facebook and scream till I'm blue in the face and convince nobody. I have this idea for genetic engineering that I think could actually have an impact on this conversation to elevate it beyond good or bad or is it or isn't it into something more rational, nuanced. That was fundamentally the idea. I was like, okay, how do I use this technology to create products that people really love and they really want and be super transparent about the fact that the reason they love them is because they're genetically engineered. And so then the idea that we could make consumer products and be proudly GMO and just felt like that was my passion, was about having an impact on the world and impact on this conversation and advocating for this technology in a way that would matter. I think that was the inspiration for starting Zbiotics. And then what it ended up becoming and what products we ended up making were as we started discovering and working on it. But that was the core of why Zbiotics exists.
That's such a great origin story. I can't remember who it was that was on this podcast who told us that anti-GMO butterfly, or even like the organic label, is seen as a mark of superior quality or luxury, or it elevates a brand, whereas the bioengineered label is basically like a warning. So it's really up to us to change that. But as you were inspired, what was the first product that Zbiotics ended up building?
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree. And I think that there's this conflation of organic and non-GMO as healthy. Those two things are not necessarily the same thing at all. Indeed, you could engineer something like, say, rice to have vitamin A for people who are vitamin A deficient and dealing with blindness for no other reason than nutrient deficient. And somehow the fact that it was genetically engineered to do that could then be seen as a negative as opposed to something that was genuinely promoting health. So very passionate about decoupling those two things. What did we decide to do? Like I say, the goal here was getting people excited and getting their attention and connecting a benefit to the technology. So as I started to look around for like what would check those boxes, I'm a scientist. So I started in the science and I picked some ideas that I think scientifically were really interesting. But then as I started pitching them, objectively, they were not interesting consumers at all. And so I got a lot of blank stares and glossed over looks. But then I actually entered this pitch competition and was pitching the idea of a probiotic that was engineered to help you recover better from exposure to radiation. And nobody cared, nobody understood it. And at the end of the presentation, I said, there's so much we can do with this technology. We can program the bacteria to do any biological function on the planet. And I listed off all these things. At the end, I said, we could even help you feel better the day after drinking. people's eyes lit up and they were like, whoa. And it was clear at that point that was the only word in the whole presentation that they heard. And so afterwards, people were coming up to me and asking me like, hey, tell me about that thing about the drinking. And I was like, oh, that was just an example. But I realized that it was something that people understood and they were excited about. So I looked into that more and I thought, actually, this could be a really great way to introduce the tech to people. It's a problem people understand. There's this very strong visceral readout of efficacy. You feel not so great the day after you drink. That's a very clear feeling. And if we could help with that, then you would have this very clear indicator that the technology was actually creating a benefit for you. And so I started to see that there's actually a lot of value in this as sort of an ambassador for the technology, as a way to prove out the concept. And so that's what we ended up building. It was a pretty simple process from a biochemistry perspective. There's this toxic byproduct of alcohol called acetaldehyde. It actually initially forms in the gut in large part by your microbiome breaking down some of the alcohol that you drink. If we were just to make a bacteria that could help you break down that acetaldehyde, this really toxic byproduct, that would have like a meaningful impact on the way you felt the next day. So really simple reaction, very clear fit for the tech, and something that people understood and were interested in and excited about. And so that ended up being our first use case, was a probiotic engineered to help you feel better and land on your feet the next day after having a few drinks. It wasn't where I intended for us to start, but it ended up being a great place. We built that product first and launched it in August of 2019, and it's been off to the races ever since.
Wow, I love that story of you were working on something else, but then you saw this reaction from the audience and people kept on asking you about it. And then you're like, well, yeah, if I build it, they'll come. But I would love to actually know a little bit more about that, the biochemical process that happens when alcohol is consumed. You mentioned the acetaldehyde buildup. How does that build up specifically? Where you mentioned the gut and the microbes, and some people feel a headache, or what is a very specific effect on the body? And then how does the drink combat that effect?
Yeah. So most of the alcohol you drink gets absorbed pretty quickly into your bloodstream. And then the ethanol circulates out your body and has the effects that ethanol has, which is for many of us why we drink, and makes its way to the liver. When the liver breaks down that ethanol like really efficiently in two steps, it converts the alcohol into acetaldehyde using one enzyme, and then it uses a second enzyme to convert the acetaldehyde into acetate. That intermediate acetaldehyde is very toxic, much worse for you than the alcohol, but your liver is very good at doing both of those steps. So it gets it all the way to acetate, and acetate is essentially vinegar. It's innocuous. So from that perspective, the body has now detoxified the molecule. More things happen after that, but they're not really important to this story. But that's what happens to most of the alcohol. A small amount of the alcohol you drink is actually broken down directly in the gut before it's absorbed into the bloodstream. And that small amount of alcohol largely is broken down by your microbiome. The microbes in your gut are concerned about the ethanol. They have enzymes that can convert the ethanol into acetaldehyde, but they don't make a lot of that second enzyme that converts the acetaldehyde into acetate because they're less concerned about the acetaldehyde. You actually end up getting an accumulation of acetaldehyde in the gut. So even though it's a small amount of alcohol that's being broken down there, the data shows that actually it's the major source of acetaldehyde in the body. So colonic acetaldehyde levels can be 5 to 10 times higher than blood acetaldehyde levels. This ends up being the major source of acetaldehyde in the body. But acetaldehyde is a highly soluble molecule. So once it gets formed in the gut, it doesn't stay there for long. It'll get absorbed into the bloodstream. It'll circulate through the body, wreak havoc. It's this very potent molecule. And then it'll eventually make its way to the liver and be broken down really efficiently. But at that point, it's too late. We have a bacteria that essentially now we've engineered to just complete the same reactions happening in your liver, but have it happen in the gut. Engineer that bacteria to make a very similar enzyme, analogous enzyme to the enzyme your liver makes, to convert that acetaldehyde into acetate. Fundamentally, we're just moving that molecule along into acetate, which is now innocuous and detoxified. So that was the idea, was that okay, we know acetaldehyde is this really gnarly molecule and it has these effects, and we have lots of good data on what happens when you're exposed to acetaldehyde. And so the idea that this is a major source of it, if we were able to break that down, would that actually result in people feeling better the next day? And that was why we built the product, was connecting those dots seemed pretty clear. But of course, then once we built it, we had to make sure that that hypothesis was correct. That was a whole other story. But from a biochemistry perspective, that was the motivation behind using that as an application for the tech.
Yeah, I also love the way you told that. Okay, so then tell us, what did it look like from a scientific point of view? What was the journey of developing the probiotic, and how did you guys test it out in people?
Yeah. So the journey was, our philosophy around genetic engineering has been that we want to minimize unknowns as much as possible. So when we're genetically engineering something, fundamentally, we are leveraging natural processes that bacteria already use to change their own DNA. And it's just really a guiding process. The more changes you make, though, the more things that are different than what we know. So we really try to minimize our changes as much as possible so that we're minimizing kind of the unknowns. And so we think about, first and foremost, when I was deciding how we were going to engineer this, I wanted to obviously avoid anything that we know to be risky. making sure that there's no antibiotic resistance cassettes. We're not using high copy number plasmids or things that basically could be shared around to a bunch of other bacteria. You're never going to be able to prevent sharing entirely. So we wanted to engineer something that was shareable without risk, which meant that we didn't want to engineer something into the bacteria that would be totally novel to the ecosystem, that is your gut or the soil or water system, that once it passes through your body and gets out of your gut, it goes out into your toilet and into the water and into the soil. And so the gene that expresses that enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde, we chose a version of that enzyme that comes from another soil microbe that we know to be safe. It's not a pathogenic bacteria or anything like that. And it's one that our bacteria is engaged with a lot. They coexist in the soil. And so odds are good. They've already probably swapped this DNA back and forth a few times, and it just wasn't useful to our bacteria to retain it. It's useful to us. So we really minimize unknowns by doing something that we're very confident has already naturally happened in nature. And so this gene, this acetaldehyde dehydrogenase gene, homologs of it are present in 70% of all life on the planet, including obviously your liver cells and many other organisms. Many of the bacteria that are in your gut make this gene. They just don't make enough of the enzyme at the right time. The important thing is that you're getting this moment where you drink and then all of a sudden there's all this acetaldehyde there. Bacteria aren't prepared for that and they're not equipped for that. So we just want to engineer bacteria that could make this gene at the right amount when you needed it. So we really basically just tweaked the promoter system, the system where the bacteria says like how much of the gene that it should make. It's like, okay, make a lot of this gene, and then you eat it. So you're taking it at the right time, then it's making that gene while it passes your gut. But then I get to the other side, if it passes this gene around, that's not a problem. The gene already exists in the ecosystem. And then once you get out into the world, same thing. Acetaldehyde dehydrogenases are everywhere. This gene is in the soil already. So nothing we've introduced was unknown. So we weren't taking a gene, say, from a bacteria isolated from the bottom of the Mariana Trench that has never been introduced into this ecosystem. So we really try to be really restrictive with that in order to be highly conservative and make sure that we're not creating some crazy unknown situation.
Wow. Yeah. I'm really curious what that soil microbe is. I don't know if you can share that.
Yeah. So the bacteria is called Cuprivata necator or necata. I'm not really sure how you say it. But just a soil microbe. It's commonly found in the environment. It's not pathogenic to people. It's not a probiotic. It's not something that we use in the food industry or anything, but there's no known cases of pathogenicity or anything like that. So it just ends up being like most bacteria that just float around out there that we engage with all the time that just don't do anything for us one way or the other. It was a good source because it was compatible with the bacteria we were already using, which I think is also a really strong point for us not breaking evolutionary bottlenecks or boundaries.
Yeah. I just love the fact that it's a soil microbe. So likely it is going into our food anyway. Even if you wash it, it's perhaps there.
Definitely the bacteria that we're giving you is, right? Bacillus subtilis is the bacteria we use. And that's a microbe that is everywhere. It's all over all the foods we eat. Humans have been using it in food fermentation for centuries intentionally. We're used to eating high doses of it. And what's interesting about Bacillus subtilis is that even though humans eat it all the time, and we have been eating it for as long as humans have existed, it's evolved to just pass through our gut. It doesn't actually join our microbiome. And I thought that was a really strong point for safety, that we're not trying to edit your microbiome. And safety and consistency, right? Like I think a lot of probiotics are predicated on this idea that they're going to join your microbiome. And I think that understanding is incredibly flawed when it comes from a microbiological perspective. Everybody's microbiome is totally unique and totally different. And they're very complex communities and networks of bacteria that are connected and interbalanced. The inputs and outputs that are happening from one bacteria to the next are very unique, like this delicate web of interactions. And so if you're just sort of like bombard that system with one bacteria that you're trying to cram in there, that's going to totally create havoc and or not going to be successful. So trying to force engraftment or seeding of the gut, it's not very likely. And I think we have lots of data over the last 30 years to show that it's next to impossible. And also probably not a good idea, given that everybody's microbiome is so different. Why would there be any silver bullet? So we like the idea that Bacillus subtilis is one that the microbiome is very familiar with. Everybody's bacteria in their gut have seen it, and it passes right through. And so we say, okay, while it's passing through and floating down the river, we've engineered it to perform this function of breaking down acetaldehyde, and then you pass it out the other side about a day later, and then it's agnostic to sidesteps the complexity and the individuality of the microbiome.
When I think about the way that probiotics or prebiotics are sold, what you said, Zach, is super interesting. It's a super complicated community. And the way that they're sold is they're supposed to make you healthier. Or what I've also heard is as we get older, the microbiome could use a little help when it comes to digesting food, especially as you reach 70 or 80 years old. And so having a probiotic is probably a good thing, or prebiotic. But what I'm curious about is in terms of the genetic engineering that you guys have done, what was your approach to doing that? What makes it different from other products that are out there, if there's any like probiotic that's similar? And what does it look like when a user takes it?
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Yeah. The first thing, the most important thing is the fact that it's a probiotic really ends up just being like a delivery mechanism, a chassis. But what we're really delivering here is the function of acid breakdowns. That's what makes us unique. The probiotics industry as a whole is, I don't know, like, hey, they're largely just the leftovers of the food industry, like lactobacillus and bifidor, things we use in like the dairy industry. And then we say, we know they're not harmful. And sometimes people seem to see a benefit from it. We give it to you and we say like, hey, I hope this helps with gut health. And there's not anything directed about that. I think the most generous thing you can say about a probiotic is that a given probiotic could help some people some of the time because everybody's microbiome is different. And not only that, your microbiome is constantly changing. So what helps you today might not help you tomorrow from a microbiome perspective. And the analogy I often use here is picture a person who walks into a frat party at a college and they're the life of that party. They crush it. They're so perfect for that community. Now picture that same person walking into a hipster party in Brooklyn. That person would be terrible. They would not fit into that community at all. Even a person who once would have loved to be at a frat party in college later would not find that to be a very useful community for them either. So there's a lot of dynamism happening in the gut.
I will just say really quick, though, I was in a sorority and I held my own, and now I hang out at hipster parties in Brooklyn, still hold my own. So there are these unique organisms that can transcend
you are
environments.
A unique organism, Erum.
But I would argue that you are not necessarily the same person. At least you didn't show up in the same way to both of those parties, right?
Yeah.
You evolved and
Touché.
changed, right? I think the 19-year-old you showing up at that Brooklyn party might not have been as popular as they were at the sorority party. So
100%.
Yeah,
Right.
That is the nuance for sure. But yeah, so long story short on this is that I think probiotics have a flawed hypothesis. So you brought up prebiotic. Prebiotic is a fiber that feeds the bacteria that are already in your gut. And I think that is a stronger hypothesis. Whatever your community is, let's give it the fertilizer in order to make it continue to be strong. And really, prebiotics works best when different bacteria eat different fibers. So a diversity of fibers and a diversity of prebiotics is actually like what you want to go for. So I think that's a stronger hypothesis. And so ultimately, what we're trying to do here is be totally agnostic to that. Like I say, the fact that we're a probiotic is almost like incidental. Look, you have all these functions and all this stuff happening in the gut, and we're like, that's great. You keep doing that. And we're just going to give this one bacteria that, regardless of what else it's doing, we know it's going to perform this single function. And this function is something you're going to need for the next 18 hours. So to your question, Karl, when do you use it and what happens? So our bacteria is in a small 15 ml little shot. And so you drink that before you start drinking alcohol. And the idea is that then the bacteria gets into your gut as you're drinking. And as that acetaldehyde is forming, the bacteria is already there and it's expressing this enzyme that can help your body handle the gut-derived acetaldehyde specifically. As you drink that acetaldehyde, that small amount of alcohol that doesn't get absorbed gets converted into acetaldehyde, and then our bacteria help convert that into acetate in the gut. That's fundamentally what happens. And so then what that looks like is you go out, you drink a Zbiotics product called pre-alcohol. So you pre-alcohol, then you go out and you have your responsible beverages, right? Again, this is not a get out of jail free card. You still have to drink responsibly. We're helping you deal with gut-derived acetaldehyde, but obviously the ethanol itself is not good for you, and a myriad of different things that are happening when you're drinking. Anybody who's trying to sell you a cure-all is definitely lying to you. If you have Zbiotics, it can help with gut-derived acetaldehyde. You drink responsibly, you pace yourself, you get plenty of good sleep, don't drink on an empty stomach, all the other responsible behaviors. You're going to wake up the next day and you're going to feel better than you would have felt otherwise, and you'll be able to land on your feet. And I think this is really the core value for Zbiotic, for pre-alcohol, is not so much the drinking itself. These kind of events just happen. We're adults and we socialize. We're going to have our drinks with friends at a happy hour or at a wedding or whatever. The goal is that the next day you're able to do the things you would have wanted to do anyway. A lot of times we have these healthy habits and routines that get disrupted. We have our morning workout, or we want to meet up with friends or whatever that might be. And as we get older, we don't feel so great. We might skip those things. And so then it becomes a zero-sum thing. If you have fun or enjoy yourself the night before, then you have to give up on your next morning stuff. And so Zbiotics allows you to make sure that you can maintain those healthy habits, routines, and behaviors that you have the next day. So that's fundamentally how the product is meant to fit into your life.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the responsible drinking, and this is not a get out of jail free card. I think that's a very important PSA. So listeners, be
Right.
responsible. This isn't your get out of jail free card. I love that.
Yeah. The goal here, when we think about our customer, and this is what we've heard a lot. So we sold 4 million bottles plus and counting to
Amazing.
date. Yeah, it's amazing. And every
Yeah.
bottle labeled proudly GMO. That's 4 million times somebody actively chose a GMO. What we hear from people is really that this is an opportunity for me to invest in my health and make sure that I'm able to maintain my healthy habits and routines. And really, it's like our core customers in their 30s and 40s, they're somebody who has an active lifestyle, they have active hobbies, they like to travel, they like nice food, things like that. And so this is like another tool in their tool belt, right? They already do all the other things that are important and responsible, but sometimes there's still a delta on how they feel the next day. And there's still an opportunity for improvement. And so that's where Zbiotics really fits in. It's not like, hey, now I have license to do whatever I want and not suffer the consequences. That's just, it's not realistic, and it's not a customer. It's not the kind of person also who's going to invest in their health. It's somebody who has that mentality.
Okay, so you guys developed this prebiotic. What was it that you had to do to ensure it was safe and efficacious? What kind of testing did you have to do? Were there any regulatory hurdles that you had to overcome?
Yeah. So when we launched in August of 2019, it was the world's first ever genetically engineered probiotic to go to market. So that's new. And we definitely had to show that was safe. And so we did a lot of work to demonstrate the safety of the product. It started with, as we were talking about earlier, just in the philosophy and the design. We weren't going to do something that was very out of this world. We were going to keep it very simple, very straightforward, things that likely already happened in nature, and we're just reproducing them in a way that we harness it at this moment in time that we need it. The regulatory pathway for our product is the GRAS, or generally recognized as safe food pathway. When we were building that dossier, the main crux of that argument was really that. We have this safe bacteria that you already eat every day of your life, whether you mean to or not. We have this gene that is present in 70% of all life on the planet, including many of the microbes in your gut, in the soil. We're really just putting two things we know already to be very safe together. So there was no reasonable expectation that the product would be unsafe. And then we showed that the way we engineered it, the donor strain, like you asked them, you remember earlier, we're all safe and no antibiotic resistance cassettes, no mobile genetic elements. And then we did a barrage of safety tests. We showed safety in vitro and several different gold standard tests for cytotoxicity and allergenicity and things like that. And then, of course, we did animal toxicity studies to show that even though there was no expectation to be unsafe, that we didn't see anything that was unexpected. So all those things we did, similar GRAS dossier, we published the results of that in peer-reviewed scientific journal and then declared GRAS. At that point, we're safe, able to bring it to market. But then, of course, we launched on the market and we want to make sure that people actually like the product and that they're getting the benefit that we want them to get. And so we did a lot of testing before we launched. We didn't just launch saying, oh, I hope it works. We did a lot of things on the other side of the coin. We wanted to show that given how much acetaldehyde is likely being formed in the gut when you drink, is the amount of bacteria we're giving you going to be enough to break that down in a reasonable amount of time? So we did all that testing in the lab to make sure that there's at least even a physiologically relevant likelihood that this product is actually going to create a benefit, right? Like that's a table stakes kind of first thing we have to do. And of course, we showed that. And then did a lot of testing with beta testers. Like my co-founder and I handed out thousands of samples to people and asked them their experience with the product. And we did like different ways of testing to see if people could feel that benefit that we were creating. And does breaking down acetaldehyde actually result in you feeling better the next day? A lot of questions around that. And so when we launched, we were very confident that A, we were able to break down acetaldehyde, and B, that was going to create a benefit for people. But of course, everything changes in terms of public perception once they're paying for a product. So the question then becomes whether or not we're actually creating a benefit. Do people believe that they're getting that benefit? And are people willing to pay for that benefit? And that's a whole other question. And so, but we got to the market, and the good news is the product was very strong performance in the market, like in terms of customer satisfaction and repurchase rate, all indicating and consistent with the idea that people are really feeling a benefit. So that was good. Then it was a matter of how do we present the product in a way that people are willing to overcome their skepticism? There's a lot of snake oil in the category. There's a lot of stuff claiming to do what we do, and getting people over the hump and getting people in a mindset where they're like, okay, I'm willing to give this a shot and give this a fair shake. So there's a lot of learning we had to do there. But once we got on the market, it's just continuing to gather market data to continue to inform, tweak, and change our understanding of what's important to tell people it does and doesn't do. Make sure that we're being transparent about that and setting expectations up front, as we're talking about earlier, not a get out of jail free card, things like that. So continually collecting more and more data as we go, because that's the responsible thing to do.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for saying that. And I think we can talk more about this go-to-market strategy. You're first handing out free samples and people are like, free, yes. And they're just trying it. You're helping with post effects or next day effects of drinking. But then you also have a label of proudly GMO. This is where you started. You wanted to make a GMO that helps people. So I would love to know more about how did those first people perceive GMOs, and what kind of questions were they asking you, if any, and how did you educate them about GMOs?
Yeah. So one of the biggest myths that I would love to dispel for everybody is this perception that everybody is anti-GMO. It's just not true. And we have a lot of data to show that's the case. And obviously, there's a lot of brands and media out there that would like it. The story is more interesting if everybody is anti-GMO, but that's just not what the reality of it is. Before we launched the product, we did a lot of customer discovery about all kinds of things. But one of them was core mission for Zbiotics was about advocating for GMOs. And so we really wanted to understand what people's perceptions were around genetic engineering. Where were we at? And my hypothesis from the beginning was that regardless of perceptions, if you make something that people want, they're not going to care. We see that everywhere. Nobody goes into McDonald's thinking that's good for them, but they want it. There's a value to it. And so they purchase it anyway, right? Or like you buy a can of Coke, you don't think that that's good for you. You buy it anyway. And to be clear, I'm not saying that GMOs are bad or bad for you, but even if the perception was that they were, people would still buy it if it gave them a benefit. But I wanted to know how people thought about genetic engineering. So we did lots of phone calls, lots of customer discovery, lots of surveys. And the most common thing I heard people say when I had phone calls with people was, I don't really care, but I think everybody else does. So you might not want to talk about it. We heard that from everybody. Everybody just thinks that everybody else cares, but they don't. And that was really the most common thing we heard all the time. And the data shows that. If you have unbiased surveys where you ask people, we say about 60 to 80% of people, depending on how you ask the question, basically have a net neutral or positive perception of GMOs. And then there's about 20 to 40% of people who have a negative perception. But in large part, their negative perception is heavily tied to Roundup Ready corn and soy. That's what they think when they think of GMO. When you present an alternative use case, people very quickly can see the difference. And I think that's been very important. A great anecdote I have is that one time we had a focus group. So we did a survey where we asked people what the perceptions were on GMOs. And we found some people who self-identified as very anti-GMO and opposed to genetic engineering and also consider themselves very well educated on the topic. We decided to bring them in for a focus group with the goal of kind of understanding where they get their information and kind of what their opinions are. And the goal was not to convert them or anything. It was just to learn more about how people who are opposed to this technology think and where their information is coming from. It was great. We spent an hour asking them questions, learned a ton of stuff, which I'd love to dive into at some point. But for the purpose of the story, at the end, I was just like a meet and greet and I was chatting with one of the women on the panel, and she spent the last hour saying how she's very anti-GMO and she buys non-GMO ingredients because she cooked for a church and she wants to make sure that everybody has like very healthy ingredients and blah, blah, blah. And she asked me, okay, well, like, what do you do? And so I tell her about pre-alcohol and she goes, oh, that's so cool. Can I try it? And I was like, yeah, but it's a GMO. And she's like, oh, that's okay. It was like instantaneous. I didn't make any pitch. I just told her what the product was and how the genetic engineering was used to like make the product. And that was it. And it was 20 seconds. The instant understanding that this is not the same thing. Our goal is not to just get people to like our product. Our goal is to get people to, like in that moment, she's now gone from GMOs are bad to these GMOs are bad. All of a sudden, it's already a more nuanced understanding of genetic engineering, that not all GMOs are the same thing. And that's our goal, right? Our goal is not to convince everybody that they're wrong and that all GMOs are good, because that's not true either. Genetic engineering is a technology and it makes products, and those products can be good or bad. And that's how we think about any other technology we evaluate. There's a very reasonable debate about whether or not guns are a good thing for society. People who argue on both sides of that. Nobody's arguing that the technology used to make guns is a problem. Nobody's saying like metallurgy is a bad technology and we should never use it. They're just saying its application is bad. And so that's the goal of Zbiotics, is just elevating that conversation. And it hasn't been hard to do. Fundamentally, we don't get a lot of pushback from people about the fact that it's a GMO. In fact, I oversee all of our customer service. And for the first 2 years, I did every ticket. But we get maybe a few times a month, somebody reaches out and they're complaining about the fact that one of our ingredients is natural flavors. Apparently, that's a hot topic right now, is that natural flavors is a way for companies to hide chemicals that are bad or whatever. A lot of people are frustrated about that. So we know we have nitpickers who read the label and are upset. And I can only think of one ticket in the last 3 years that somebody reached out complaining about the fact that it was a GMO. It's just not something people care about at the end of the day. So it actually hasn't been this huge insurmountable challenge. And if anything, we really lean into it. We don't just disclose that it's a GMO. We say it's proudly GMO. And we do advertisements where we show that proudly GMO box like blown up. And actually has been a really powerful differentiator for us. People are surprised to see it and they're interested. It's provocative and they click in and they want to learn more about the product. I thought GMOs were bad. What do you mean you're proudly GMO? Usually you think, well, if it's a GMO, even if I'm scared of it, well, I believe that it does something. So there's like this instant credibility. It has not at all been a liability for us. It's absolutely been an asset. That's the message I try to deliver all the time, is when these companies are trying to hide the fact that they're using genetic engineering. It's like, don't lean into it. It's not only the right thing to do and it's honest, it's also an asset for you as a brand.
It's wild to me that people are complaining about the natural flavors. We helped and we worked with K18 on their AirWash product, which contains a fusion peptide that they created. And because of the way these things have to be labeled, it says it's produced in E. coli. It includes different parts of different proteins. And so that's all on there. And it's very clear it's derived from a porcine protein. And it feels like no one's noticed that. And K18 also really leaned into it in their initial marketing. They had a pig on their marketing, and the product is sold out. The hardest thing for them has been to produce enough of the product to make it available to people. But people absolutely love it. And K18 smartly leaned into it.
Absolutely. You use technology to make a better product. You should be proud of that. The technology made this possible. And every time you're signaling to people that there's a problem. You're saying like, this is sneaky or it's bad. And it's not. Why are you doing that in the first place? Biotechnologists are getting on the same page there, but it's been our flag from the beginning that ultimately people want great products. And if you're using modern technology to make a product that's better than something they've ever had before, they're going to be excited about that. And especially if you're honest with them about it, that's what we see.
At the start of this conversation, you mentioned your excitement for using genetically modified technology to make better products. And you had one idea, then this idea for pre-alcohol came out and you started selling that 4 million bottles. Amazing for now. I mean, who knows what happens next year, 10x hopefully. But have you thought of other potential applications or right now just focusing on pre-alcohol?
No, absolutely. The whole point here is advocating for the tech and telling the best story we can. And so we certainly don't want to be seen as a product that's just one application or we're just related to like alcohol or whatever. It's a great concept, but we want to build a whole category. We want to advocate for this tech much more broadly. And so we're really excited about, as I said earlier, you can engineer any biological function on the planet into a bacteria. It would be crazy for us to stop here. I couldn't sleep at night if we did. There's too much opportunity, too much exciting things we can do. So we're definitely developing new products. We're very close to announcing the launch of our second product, which will be happening in the next few months. It's totally different, has nothing to do with drinking or alcohol, completely different use case. Same customer, somebody who's still investing in their health and cares about being proactive about getting the most out of their life and dealing with the challenges of modern living, but very different use case. We have a pipeline of products 3, 4, and 5 that are also, again, all kinds of really cool things. The goal is to show look at all the cool stuff we can do here. And in addition to that, beyond just what we can accomplish, we are really mission driven here. And it's about advocating for this tech and the responsible use of the tech, which I talked about a bit, but that is a very core part of this is that other people who are coming in to use this technology, we want to make sure that they're also being thoughtful and responsible about how they apply it. I serve unofficially or officially as an advisor or board member for several other genetically engineered probiotics companies. Some people could see that as competitors, but I see this as a rising tide raises all boats. As long as they're doing it responsibly, and that's why I like being part of the conversation with them, that if they're making cool products, that's more benefits that we're bringing out into the world because of this technology. And that's really what we want to accomplish. And that's really our vision for the future. It's not just us, it's lots of people.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the other companies that need to be responsible. I don't know if you saw this recent Scientific American article about a new product that is starting to be developed, being in the hands of consumers called Lumina, which is an oral microbe. The initial claim was to prevent cavities, but then they had to remove that claim because that is a health claim. So they're talking about it in the context of a cosmetic to help with teeth whitening. And Zbiotics was actually mentioned in this article as another genetically modified product to hit the market. But there's a lot of controversy around this product because it's an oral microbe. It can be transmitted through kissing or eating or other ways. And this microbe is meant to be inoculated and introduced into a microbiome versus your product just leaves the body. Do you have any thoughts around this? I'm really curious to know.
Always keeping tabs on what people are doing in the space. The category is very near and dear to me. So definitely always want to know what others are doing. And yeah, so to give a little bit of background on that strain that is in that product, this was developed decades ago. And it started as actually a natural isolate of a strain of bacteria called Strep mutans that is naturally part of the oral microbiome. It's a major cause of cavities because it's an acid producer, and acid is what erodes the enamel. I want to be clear here that dental microbiome is not my area of expertise, so everything I say here may not be perfect, but giving broad strokes, general ideas here. So the idea was they basically had this version of Strep mutans that was actually able to secrete, it was able to go on offense essentially and create a pocket for itself in the mouth microbiome. That part was natural. That had already occurred. Originally, that natural isolate was actually isolated from this scientist's mouth. And then he thought, wow, well, this is a really cool opportunity. It can basically box out the bad version of Strep mutans if I make this version innocuous, not be able to produce the acid that it would normally produce. So the edit was made to make the bacteria capable of basically not making acid as its lactic acid as its endpoint of its metabolism. So it doesn't acidify the mouth, but its ability to box out other bacteria and other strains of strep mutans that can be acidic was a natural isolate. And that's where the engineering happened. And then basically they're like, oh, this is great. And they tried to bring this to market, and they went through, the goal was to go through FDA clinical trials to get it approved to prevent cavities. And they struggled to basically get it off the ground. As I understand it, to be clear, I don't have intimate knowledge here. This is only from my own reading of what's been published in the media and stuff. But was exactly like you said, that the problem was that if you put it in somebody's mouth and this person signed an informed consent form and says, yes, I'm willing to test this product on my mouth, then they kiss their significant other, and the significant other did not sign an informed consent form, that they could be inoculated with this drug. And so there was no good way to basically contain. What this really highlights is not so much that the product is unsafe or anything, it's really that our clinical trial program is not set up to deal with live biotherapeutic products. It's set to deal with small molecules that you can very much control. So that ended up being why this floundered. And so it doesn't make the product inherently unsafe. It's just unfortunate that we haven't had a good way to test it yet. And so I think it's reasonable to have the conversation around like whether or not a product like this is safe. But I would argue that its ability to create a niche for itself is actually something that already exists in nature commonly. Like, many of us have strep mutans that has the same function. So really the fact that this one can't create acid is the only delta on what we already have seen before. I think that with anything new, there's always going to be unknowns. And I would say that a product like this is definitely very different than ours. Like you said, ours is meant to pass right through, and this is meant to try and seed the microenvironment. And so I think that there's questions that need to be answered there, but ultimately its ability to spread and things like that are already very common. And so I think that sort of like ecological risk doesn't really exist because that already exists in the world. So a question about whether a bacteria that doesn't produce acid is going to create other problems in the mouth is maybe a question that we don't technically have an answer for in nature. I think it's hard to come up with a hypothesis for how that would be risky, but that's certainly not me saying that it's not. That's where I stand on that. So anyway, I guess the long story short on that to your question is that, yeah, I'm aware of it. I think it's a much trickier question than ours, because I think one of the things that was important for us was we, from the beginning, before we ever made a single experiment in the lab, we had a very clear vision of where we wanted the product to be at the end and what the regulations and what the safety concerns would be from the beginning. And so we designed the product with all that in mind to ensure that we are minimizing risks and unknowns. And that was not the case with this. This was built in like 2000 when it was initially as an academic project. That wasn't the endpoint that we thought of. And so now they're trying to retrofit the product to the regulatory pathway. And that's been challenging. And I think that wouldn't be the way I would approach genetically engineering new products today. That's one of these things where it's a grandfathered situation. I think it's the edge case of the outlier. I think that as we think about how we develop products in the future, we should be responsible in developing them from the beginning with a clear endpoint in mind from the get-go.
Yeah. That new strain that was developed isn't producing the acid, but it's producing alcohol. So I don't know if you can combine it, because you could collab and do the pre-alcohol and swish it in the mouth.
The amount of alcohol is so minor. It's minuscule. So lots of microbes that we have will produce ethanol, fermenting sugar. If you have sensitive equipment, you'll always be able to detect a small amount of ethanol in our bloodstream. And this is within that normal range. It's a very small amount.
It brings up a couple of things, because the way I understand it, Erum, you know this better than I do. Their product is meant to be a one and done. You swish and then you're not going to have cavities anymore.
No, it's not one and done, right?
Oh, it's not?
They have microbes like in a powder form, and then you rub your teeth with the powder. Then I think leave it in your mouth for a little bit and then buy another one for the next month and then the next month. And they said that it might take them up to 2 years for it to really inoculate in your mouth.
I mean, you should never. At the end of the day, it has this ability to box out other bacteria. But in your microbiome, nothing is reliably permanent. It can happen, but you're certainly not going to be able to create that reliably. And so everything you're trying to do with the microbiome is the thing where you're constantly having to do it. That's why you have to eat fiber every day. It's important. You constantly are going to be working against dynamic change with the microbiome. So I think that for me, I get a lot more comfort knowing that you have to use that every month than literally you just do it once and then it's done. I think A, that's microbiologically just not real. And B, if it was real, that would make me a lot more concerned.
Yeah, the other thing that in talking about it and reading the Scientific American article, it just made me go, well, there are people who never get cavities. And what does their microbiome look like? And what's the relation with this? How populated is their microbiome by this bacteria? So it's like a different kind of study that would need to be done. But then how does this play into it? I'm with both of you in that if it was something that you just did once a month and you knew it wasn't going to be a permanent inoculation, I think that would probably make it a little bit more palatable to a lot of people. But I wish them well, and I want to get them on here. I want to talk about this.
Yeah, I was going to say that. We should have them come on.
Totally.
I think the idea is to permanently inoculate, because then you'll keep things fresh. Which is funny. Side story is that last year we interviewed John Cumbers, and I asked him the question, if you could make any company, what would you make? And he said an oral microbiome company. I don't know if he knew about Lumina. He didn't mention them. And
Yeah.
then lo and behold, they were at
Yeah.
Beta.
Yeah, no, I have some friends that are in the space, some microbiologists from my PhD that went on to do like microbiome sequencing in the mouth. And I think there's just like a lot of really cool stuff that can happen there. I totally agree. It's a fascinating space. Physically, I mean, the mouth microbiome is like a really fascinating space. So yeah.
Yeah. And the gut microbiome, which is where you're living.
Without a doubt. Goes without
Without a
saying.
doubt. That's the coolest microbiome.
That's the layup, but I think overlooked. Really, that's the thing is the gut microbiome, as we talk about a lot, and there's a lot, but you think about the mouth microbiome, the nasal microbiome, the vaginal microbiome,
the scalp, the skin, they're all different.
And they're all leverage points for us to improve human health. And it's so exciting. So I'm very excited about all the things that we can do.
Amazing.
On that note, then, there's so much opportunity. I mean, we can maybe do an exercise of visioneering, but how do you see the role of biotechnology evolving within the next decade, specifically in the consumer health products world, right? That's the world that you're living in. And how do you envision Zbiotics playing a role in this future? I would love to get some visioneering. I know you have some products coming out. We don't have to talk about those, but just in general.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is what we think about. Part of our mission internally, we talk a lot about kind of building a category and creating space in the market and everything. It's the inevitable future. It's a question of not if, but when. We're going to be using biotechnology to make better products for healthy people. As often happens, new technologies come out and they first enable great and biggest problems. A lot of times with these go to the drug industry first and they solve diseases, and that's good. And then after a while, they'll trickle down to healthy people. So I think that's where we're at right now. Biotechnology is enabling us. It used to be until about 15, 20 years ago. And now most of this is the strategy we're using is we just sort of like look around and grab things off the store shelf or out of the ground and just say, like, hey, I hope maybe this will help. Maybe this has a thing that could be helpful in some way. And so, all these like natural products and stuff that we're looking for, and it might have some level of benefit, but if we can fundamentally understand how they work or what's going on in your body and how that works, then we can really purpose build solutions. And I think that's the stage we're at right now, that we're starting to purpose build solutions and we understand how they work, which is a lot safer. I think people think of like plants as safe. Plants are like the source of all poisons on the planet. The little red berries in your backyard that you're not supposed to eat, like perfect example, like just because it's a plant and it has thousands of chemicals and you put it in your body and you're like, oh, it's a plant. And it makes you feel better. So this is like natural. You can have all kinds of problems and liver toxicity. Even if like the one chemical actually is helping you, what about the other, 1,999 of them? So the idea that we can fundamentally understand the problem and then fundamentally purpose build a solution that is targeted and minimizes the unknowns and complexity, that is really the next stage. And that's where we're at. And that's how we think about it when we think about drugs. But then, of course, for some reason, the supplement space, that's almost seen as like a bad thing. And so I think that as we sort of evolve and build products that people actually want and they actually create the work and they create the benefits people want, that more and more people are going to start to look for, oh, this is a much better way for this to work. And so I think that's a win. That's going to happen. And so if it happens tomorrow or it happens in 30 years, Zbiotics is obviously trying to usher that in sooner. This is a safer, more sustainable, better, more approachable way to benefit human health than just scouring nature, giving things to you and saying, let's see what happens. That's our goal, is to show that we can use modern biotechnology to build products that align with your values and are done sustainably and create the benefits you want. This is the playbook for how we do it. And these are the guardrails. And here's the things we won't do that are irresponsible. And that the industry then, along with us, helps create those guardrails and sticks to them. And so creates like a space for innovation that is also one that mitigates risks and unknowns. I think that's the future I see. And that's the one we're trying to create. And that's what we're really passionate about. A huge focus for our company is we call it GEM, or genetically engineered microbe, GEM safety. What are the responsible ways you can build that result and benefit without unnecessary risk? And so I think that's the future. And we're hopefully be an important part of shaping that future. But I also hope that we end up just being one of very many.
Amazing. So as we close things out, Zack, you are one of the few people who've transitioned from academia to entrepreneurship. So I'm curious, what kind of advice would you give to aspiring biotech entrepreneurs that are looking to make a positive impact with their innovation or technologies?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's got to be passion for that specifically. If the root of the passion is that you really are excited by the idea that like your science can get into people's hands, that's where you should be, is being in entrepreneurship, because that's the opportunity. That you can fund your science and translate your science into things that actually go into people's hands and affect their lives directly. And if that's what you're excited about, it's not like discovery, no qualifications put on that. These are all valuable things. Discovery or curing disease, all those things are really valuable things, but entrepreneurship is tangentially affect all those things. Ultimately, if the core passion is, I want my science to impact people's lives in a positive way and I want it to go into their hands, then that's where the opportunity is. And so I think that's first and foremost why you would start a company as opposed to joining somebody else's. And then I think understanding that along those lines, that entrepreneurship is also about business. cool science does not equal commercializable science. I think that's one of the hardest things to learn. And I know for me, it was pitching a probiotic that helps with exposure to radiation was definitely cool science. It was not really commercializable science. I think really understanding the goal here is that the science has to be something that's viable that people want and really connecting those things together. And then it's just a lot of practice. I don't think there's any training that exists right now. And so it's a lot of like practicing, explaining your science and getting people excited about it and tailoring and tweaking what you're building. I think people often think that scientists often think that's like dirty to have people or business influence how you do your science, but that's what it is. Use your science to build something people want. So you have to understand what they want to then inform what science you're going to build. You have to be comfortable with that. And that just takes a lot of practice and learning kind of how to balance those two things.
Well said. Thank you so much, Zack. This has been such a treat. We've been wanting to get you on for quite some time, almost over a year. After I saw you on a panel singing the song of genetically modified organisms. And I was like, I love this perspective. You're laying the groundwork for the future, and we appreciate you and we thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zack.
This was awesome. I really appreciate you having me on. This was super fun.
Erum, what do you think about Zack and Zbiotics and our conversation with them?
You could just hear the passion in his voice. He has been gung-ho. Genetic engineering knows that GMOs can pave the way for new products that can be healthy for ourselves and for the environment. And I thought it was really lovely to hear how he started with a different product. He was saying it was a microbe to treat radiation, something along those lines. And he was doing this presentation and he mentioned that, okay, I'm doing this thing, but you can do all these other things. And then the audience heard about the next day effects of alcohol. They talked about how you can take a probiotic and they're like, wait, what? You mentioned that briefly, but let's talk about that more. And he saw that the consumer was very interested in taking a probiotic to help with the digestion of alcohol, you can say, now that we learned about how the next day effects of alcohol happen. I thought that was very, very interesting to learn about. It can go in the blood, but it can also stay in your gut. And when it's in your gut and you're not eating and you're just constantly drinking, it ends up causing the hangover effect. I really appreciated that he's thinking of the consumer, but he knows that this is the beginning. This is the beginning. This is just one product. I'm so excited to learn about the new products that are coming out. But what about you? What did you think? You knew him for a bit longer. This is exciting. Consumer biotech. Here we go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I really understood how the product came about. So I really appreciated the way he told the story. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lesson for all potential entrepreneurs there that if your audience is telling you something, you should pay attention to it because maybe that's the product you should be developing. We're very excited about consumer biotech, and I think there's going to be a lot more products like this. And so it's really going to be up to the companies to educate consumers on what that really means. There was an article last week in Glossy about consumer biotech in the beauty industry, and it talked about how Dendy have been advertising their biotech. But the point of the article was there's a lot of biotech in beauty, and consumers are really looking for natural ingredients. I'm not sure that story of how biotech effectively replaces natural ingredients is being told. I think we can do a better job of that. But I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And clearly we need to see a lot more of it, not just in probiotics or prebiotics, but in beauty and in all products.
Yeah. One of the things I also appreciated about Zack's commentary was how he looked at the safety of using an engineered microbe. And we talked about a bit of the controversy that's happening with another engineered microbe for the oral microbiome and how we need to look at this concept of releasing engineered microbes into the market. So for Zack to walk us through how they first discovered this microbe or they identified this microbe. It's a common soil microbe. We're consuming it anyway, how it passes through our bodies. It doesn't exchange DNA. I don't know how much of that they put in their marketing if they need to, because it was great to hear that consumers aren't necessarily like, oh, anti-GMO. It's just now you're like, okay, we get that some things need to be GMO. So let's just move on and just tell me, does this work? Does it have an efficacy? How does it have an efficacy? So it sounds like consumers do want to be more educated when it comes to science, and they want to. I mean, of course, especially now that we have all these tools to learn a lot faster. In the previous episode with Michael Fisher, he made a great point saying that we all have access to AI. We can all be scientists. So you can be a little bit more science focused in your marketing. You can add biology and those concepts, and it won't be super confusing to the consumer, especially if you walk them down the story in a way that's understandable, not just throwing scientific terms at them, but you're saying, this is what it is, this is how it works, this is what it's going to do, and this is why it's safe. And I think people will be more receptive to that. So Zack Abbott, Z Biotics, they're doing a great job. They're thinking about all aspects of using GMOs. It's very exciting to see that, okay, this is a great use case. What are some other use cases, and what does safety look like?
Yeah, I think it's really good. And Zack and Zbiotics say proudly GMO. We talked about Ginkgo Bioworks at the beginning. Ginkgo has been giving away these stickers and t-shirts for years that say, I heart GMOs. And earlier in one of our episodes, Nathan Pumlin, who has engineered a purple tomato, said that the organic label is seen as a premium marker of a product, whereas the bioengineered label is seen as a warning. And I think it's really up to us as pro-biotech, pro-GMO people to really help people understand what that bioengineered label means, and that bioengineered can mean premium, because it does.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good example of that is K18 hair. And for those listeners who really want to dig into the microbiome and learn more about it, I would say our episode with Stephanie Culler of Precipity is really good. She does a great job explaining how the microbiome in your gut changes and why drug developers really need to be focused on how that microbiome changes, because it does impact absorption, it impacts mood. Gut microbiomes are involved in all sorts of things. So great episode. I think we should recommend people listen to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then just microbiomes in general, our friends at Cultivarium, so Neely, we have an episode with her. She mentions a bit more about the microbiome and just specific microbes in general and their whole approach. And then one other episode that I'll recommend is the episode with Aaron Schacht of Biome Edit, where they're looking at the microbiomes of other animals like cows and chickens. They're using all these advanced tools. I wonder what types of insights that they glean. What are the commonalities of microbiomes across different people, across different animals, across microbiome from the soil versus our guts? It'd be very interesting to see. I'm all about the microbiome. I know we'll be speaking with more people about the microbiomes coming up in the next few months. So definitely stay tuned if you want to learn more about microbiomes here on the Grow Everything podcast.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's the pod. If you're interested in becoming one of our Patreons and becoming part of the community, please check the show notes, because all that information is in there. It's like getting a cup of coffee with your nerdy friends in biotech. And we try to keep it high level so you can understand why we are able to grow everything.
Yep. That's the pod. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.